dive in to the Masters of Creativity Session 2. We were overwhelmed and invigorated by the level of engagement in the last program. We said, hey, let's do some more of these talks. So we're really happy to see you all. And these are talks where basically we share some of our own experience, our own practice, and then things we've observed in students, in organizations, and also as we study the history of innovation, invention, scientific discovery, and art, some of the keys that masters of creative practice have leveraged to maximize their innovative output. And as we joked last time, if you've ever been flying next to Professor Klebahn, you'll know that he often hits fast forward on movies. And if you're like him, you might want to hit fast forward on the talk. You can go and download these slides here and you can choose your own speed of consumption if you'd like.
I think the idea is you get the gist of it and you can figure out if you want to watch it later. You're taking that out of context. It's not an example of
But that being said, welcome to session number 2. We're stoked to share with you. We'll tell just a little bit about ourselves and then we're going to dive into the topic at hand today.
All right. So a little about us. So that's for the roughly, I don't know, half of you maybe that don't know us before. We're instructors at Stanford. We're adjunct professors. We teach classes with Catherine, who's here also, on leadership, leading disruptive innovation, and putting students into organizations to lead innovation efforts, which is super, super fun and super challenging. And then we also run an incubation effort. So how to commercialize products and services called Launchpad, where we use design methodology to launch businesses. Look at the website. There's loads and loads of companies who've been doing it for 11 years now. And then with executives, we run programs like Design Thinking Bootcamp, customer-focused innovation. Andy Papa's in here who teaches with us in that program, as well as a few of the coaches I saw come in. And folks that have been through that, you'll recognize maybe some of the names, and some of our coaches are on here on the talk as well. And then we do a bunch of online courses, which we'll talk about at the end, which we're really proud of, which are ways to engage with this content that allow you to learn how to lead sessions, that allow you to learn at your own pace, that you can do at a distance. And those have been available for, I think we started about 7 or 8 years ago, and we've done more and more of that content. We're very proud of it.
The joke is we've been doing this since roughly we were in high school. If you can tell, we've been doing it together for a long time, 11 or 12 years. We've had a lot of good times.
Yeah.
And some of the methods that we started with at the D.school, you may be familiar with the hexagons, for example. Some of the methods that we started with are starting to feel a little dated to us as we are immersing in organizations and as we're interacting with innovators around the world. And so we want to share some updates to our thinking, kind of a software update, so to speak. One of the things that we have seen is that most folks, when they think about creativity and they think about innovation, they think about sprint. They think in terms of speed and fast action and a workshop and a weekend hackathon or something like that. And to us, that's akin to grabbing ideas from the grocery store. You're just going to pick them up off the shelf like you pick up your gallon of milk, or like you pick up a head of kale or something. Does kale come in a head? It doesn't. Head of lettuce. But we would say that's actually not reflective of what we observe in history and in the innovators that we know. What we observe is instead they have a careful habit and a careful practice that enables them to flourish and allows ideas to routinely come out of their practice. And so what we want to focus on is more, what are the routine habits and the behaviors that masters of creativity cultivate in their daily life that lead to innovative output. And our belief is that creativity isn't a gift that you're born with or you're not. We believe it's a craft, just like any other craft, like painting or like playing piano or many other crafts. You hone it through practice. And so what we want to do is we want to share some of the practices of some of the masters in hopes that we make it practical and simple enough that everyone can apply them into their lives.
And if this is a practice, and you've got to get better at it, we thought, well, what does this make us? So we went to, both Dana Carvey fans. For those of you, we'll date ourselves. Saturday Night Live, Hans and Franz. It would make us Hans and Franz because we want to pump you up.
You'll up.
If you don't know what we're doing, it's really funny, and you got to just Google it later. Hans and Franz SNL, and then the joke will be like, it'll make you laugh later. So this talk has like an afterlife. It'll be great.
With that being said, the series is 4 talks. The last talk was really about focusing on inputs. This talks about collaboration. It's because it's so critical. As we were pulling the material together for today's talk, it could easily be 2 or 3 talks. There's a ton of stuff we want to cover. The next session is going to be on experimentation. And then the 4th session of the series is around updating your creative operating system. So for those who weren't with us last time, the very, very brief recap is that creativity is not about your output. When most folks think about creativity, they think in terms of output. But for us, what we know is that creativity is actually a function of inputs. And those who have a robust creative practice are really disciplined about seeking unexpected inputs. And that was the subject of the last session, is how do we take this discipline of input seeking that we call inspiration and bring it into the course of our daily lives? We're not going to talk much about that. We can send a link to it later if you're interested. But what we find is that masters of creativity are obsessed with fresh input and routinely stimulating their thinking with fresh input. One of the inputs that we thought we'd cover when we thought it was just a 1-session program was this idea of collaboration. But as I said, as we got into the topic, it's such a rich topic, we felt it was worthy actually of an entire session on its own. And what we would say is, very simply, collaborators are an incredibly rich source of unexpected inputs. If you take as a premise that input drives output, and your goal is to seek out as many unexpected inputs as possible, one of the primary levers to seek unexpected input is the collaborators that you surround yourself with. And what we've observed in the Masters of Creativity is there are a handful of key levers that they use to make sure that they have what we call a balanced portfolio of perspectives in their life and their work. And what we've observed as we've interacted with organizations and as we've interacted with innovators is there are some that are very natural levers for us to draw on, and they're familiar, and there are others that folks have never even considered before. And so our hope is to equip you with a little bit of a rubric or an assessment, so to speak, so that you can figure out what are levers that you aren't pulling that you could be pulling to amplify the power of diverse perspectives in your life and your work. There's an institution on the East Coast that rhymes with Marvard, but they've done a lot of research on this topic. And we recommend these articles. The point is, there's a lot of research that indicates that when you're seeking to generate fresh outputs, a diversity of inputs and a diverse team is going to be way more productive and yield way more breakthrough outcomes than a homogeneous team. And so a lot of our thinking on this topic is shaped not only by this research, but also from our practical experiences in mashing together different perspectives in our work in life. And Perry's going to tell a quick story about how this looked in the context of his career previous to coming to Stanford.
So in the early 2000s, I had a leadership position at a company you may know. I think it's pretty well known now as Patagonia clothing company. I'm wearing one of the jackets that are best now. Believe it or not, at that time, the product line, for a number of reasons, really needed to get revitalized. So I was part of a group that came in to help them really revitalize things. Things had changed with sourcing, particularly with China, and differences in how things were sourced. And it meant that a lot of new product had to come out that was really relevant. And this is a story about moving into the surf market. And I don't know if we have any surfers out there. Yeah, somebody's from Ventura. But if anybody surfs in a wetsuit, go ahead and put in chat what their sort of pet peeves are about wetsuits, and we'll see if you sort of get to some of the outcomes here. But one of the things we wanted to do was enter the surf market. And there's, as you know, like surf market's got loads of big companies, Quicksilver, Billabong, all these companies, and they produce movies. They are super cool with younger people. And we realized, hey, this is going to be kind of difficult. How could we do this differently? So we structured the team a little bit differently. In looking into wetsuits in particular, we took a group of people down to Mexico to go surfing, which was super fun, and brought along there's a brief primer on clothing. So the way clothing works is in industries that are like Patagonia is you have a designer design something, it goes to a product manager, goes to a developer, then eventually goes to a sales rep. You make a bunch of samples and you hope you got it right. And what we did was we brought everybody from that group together and brought them on a surf trip and said, hey, we want to figure out how to do some new product. Let's bring all of you there. And this was such an example to me that struck me of diverse perspective. Is one of the people happened to be this individual, Tetsuya Ohara. He went on to have a neat career doing fabrics at Gap and all this kind of stuff, but he was the developer in charge of fabrics. And I remember vividly, we went out surfing with this group and he got really, really cold. And he kept looking at the wetsuit, thinking, what is this stuff? What is this material? It kind of smells funny. It's, for those of you who surf, they can smell funny. It's also doesn't really dry that quickly. It seems hard to get on. He sort of noticed these things as a novice and somebody who wasn't a surfer, just that as somebody that's around the water a lot, like myself and some of the other people, we thought this is a given. We're going to do a neoprene wetsuit. How are we going to do it a little bit better? And what happened was, if you read about the Patagonia product that's still on the market, it actually has wool as a liner, which is naturally doesn't smell and keeps people warmer. It has this decomposed limestone in the exterior, all this kind of stuff. It uses natural rubber rather than synthetics. So it was a totally different product, and it allowed us to make a wetsuit a lot thinner. For those of you who surf, a thinner wetsuit means lighter, means you can move easier, you can get in and out of it easier, all this kind of stuff. But it was a really amazing innovation I'm really proud of. And it came directly from this idea of diverse perspectives, including somebody at the beginning of this process that had no background in surfing, but had a really interesting area of interest and expertise they were able to bring to the work and take it a new direction. Jeremy, you're muted.
What I love most about that story is how Perry was able to rationalize a surf trip, which is great. But it's a great example of how you would think. I mean, the invite list probably traditionally comprised of folks who love surfing, folks who are familiar with why a wetsuit is, the lesser of two evils, right? But who never really expected that it could be spectacular, that it could be made with something different. And by inviting someone with a radically different perspective, who didn't even love the sport, who's usually involved much later, you see how they unlocked incredible potential. And so there's lots of reasons that we think it's important to think about balancing a portfolio of perspectives, meaning all of the different perspectives that you bring to bear on a challenge in your life and in your work. But the reality is sometimes we don't really know even what the various dimensions are, let alone where our needs are. And so we want to cover a few and then have a conversation even in the chat about which ones resonate with you and which ones do you feel like you're lacking in. Here are the 8 that we're planning to cover today. And they may not mean anything yet to you at the beginning, but hopefully they will by the end. The idea is we'll just go from 1 o'clock all the way around, but leveraging learning circles, having pen pals, leveraging your customer as a collaborator, cultivating weak links, leveraging inexperienced experience, having or assigning notice novices, seeking out complementary collaborators, and then finally, creating space for candor. And what we want to do is we want to dive into each of these topics and share a couple of stories and anecdotes to illustrate what we mean by these. So the first one is learning circles. And this is a really, really powerful tactic that we learned from a hero of ours named Ben Franklin. In colonial America, he's the foremost author, statesman, inventor. He was responsible for inventions from bifocals to mapping the Gulf Stream to the first public libraries, the first fire departments, the Continental Congress, for crying out loud. The guy did it all. I highlighted swim paddles there. Shout out to Perry because Perry's a swimmer. I got you. But I mean, you think about the diversity of outputs that Franklin was responsible for. What do you attribute it to? One of the things that really struck me as I read a biography of his a while back is that every single week for 30 years, he met with a group of people that he called his junto. This was a group of artisans and tradesmen. He also referred to it as a leather aprons club, but it was basically a group of people from different industries who he thought were interesting that he gathered together to share learnings on a weekly basis. And what's fascinating is he had very clear rules for engagement for the group. He had a series of questions that they were to answer. Has anyone moved to Philadelphia recently whom we ought to know? Has anyone's business succeeded unexpectedly, and what are the reasons? Is there any new discovery in science that we ought to share with one another? Has anyone's name fallen into disrepute, and what can we learn from it? These are questions that they ask one another. They had like 24 or 25 questions that they covered every week. But for 30 years, he made a routine habit of meeting with people outside of his organization. And when we think about collaborators, almost de facto, most of us think about people inside our team, inside our company. And what we'd say is, as we look across history, the history of invention and innovation, folks who are wildly successful are thoughtful about cultivating networks beyond their organization as well. And there's a lot of research on this. One of our favorite researchers is a psychologist at Dartmouth named Kevin Dunbar. And he's done a lot of research in lab environments and how researchers come up with scientific breakthroughs. And one of the very simple takeaways from Dunbar's research is discoveries aren't made under the microscope. They're made at the conference table. They're made as researchers come together and talk about what's not working, or ask each other questions, or kick around ideas. And one of the interesting things, I was reading one of his old papers the other day, and I love this quote we put here on the slide. He witnessed a breakthrough. He was studying 4 science labs in parallel, and he witnessed a breakthrough, and he had hours and hours of footage and things like that. And when he could dissect the breakthrough perfectly. He actually knew exactly what happened in the chain of logic that led there. It was a series of analogies and references to other industries, et cetera. It's really fantastic. But one thing that's amazing is the team had no idea how they got the breakthrough. And you ask them a week later, a month later, 9 months later, they have no idea. But the point is, they position themselves in such a way that they increase their likelihood of stumbling upon a breakthrough, even if they don't know how they got there. And to us, that's where this idea of the junto is really powerful, is making a decision to meet with folks outside of my direct sphere of work, not because I know that I'll be able to perfectly trace it, but because I know that diverse inputs are going to affect my thinking in ways that I can't even predict. And what's fascinating is 16 years after Franklin started the junto in Philadelphia, he ended up starting an intercontinental junto called the American Philosophical Society. And it was based on some of the same principles as the junto was. But what they did is they would mail one another letters or pamphlets 4 times a year, and they would rotate. And you can see here, these are just a few of the guidelines, right? But I love that highlighted part at the end. All philosophical experiments that let light into the nature of things. They were voracious for learning and eager to share with one another. And the point is, this was a practice. If you think about the lifetime of invention and creativity, one of the key levers that Franklin leveraged was this notion of radically diverse perspectives, routinely gathering with them to share the things that were noteworthy and interesting to them, having a few rules of engagement, et cetera. You see here, there's a handful of, I'm somewhat obsessed with this idea of a junto and Ben Franklin in general. So I've written a few blog posts about him. You can check them out if you want. It's only for those who want to go deep down the rabbit hole of nerddom, but join me there. The water's warm. I'm in a woolen wetsuit and it feels great. Next up, Perry Klebahn, pen pals.
All right. So this idea of pen pals and you know, those of you who've had design thinking training with us, this idea of sharing unfinished work, you know, is I think an experience. Those of you that have been through the boot camps with us had that experience of how valuable that can be. So a story from history is Charles Darwin. You may have read about his notebooks, which is another sort of fascinating story about how he documented things. And the thing that I was astounded in terms of his use of pen pals and sharing work with others was he did these numbers stand like 15,000 letters, you know, 231 collaborators, all these different scientists. what's amazing is his voyage on the Beagle as a 20-something-year-old, researcher was in the 1830s, and he published his final sort of papers and his theories almost in 1860. So you think about like, oh, he didn't come back and was super inspired and write up the paper and submit it. He would cut up his notebooks and send pieces to different folks for input, and a lot of the connections he drew were from his active use of letters to basically get input from different folks in different fields to see what they saw in some of the material he had collected when he went down to the Galapagos in the 1830s. And it took him years to compile that and actually put it together. But a great example of using diverse perspectives and actively sharing something with somebody not in his field. He'd share something with a botanist. So read about it. There's loads and loads written about it. And a different story for another time is his notebooks and how he coded them is fascinating as he got these results and documented it.
We've got a colleague at the D.school named Leticia Britos, who is an incredible, prodigious sharer as well. And she's got to have it. We were talking with her the other day, and she just happened to mention it, but we love this as a practice. She was on a run, and she was listening to a podcast and heard something that seemed relevant to a student that she knew and a problem they were trying to solve. And she stopped running, took out her headphones, and went through the kludgy share sequence to send a student a podcast. And it's something that she routinely does. She has a commitment to herself. When she hears something that would be beneficial to someone else, she stops whatever she's doing and she shares it. So the point is not that you have to, like Darwin did, write handwritten letters and literally laboriously cut and paste into new letters. We're living in the 21st century, but will you stop a run and send a podcast to a friend? Are you aware of other people's problems, other people's inquiries, and are you active? I see Phil on the line here. Phil is he's an exemplary example of someone who sends me things that he thinks I'll find interesting, right? There's lots of people like that. But thinking about cultivating a network through sharing is a radically rich and rewarding practice. We wrote a little bit about Leticia's practice there on that blog post. The next topic that we want to cover is this idea of a customer, leveraging your customer as a collaborator. And at the D.school, we teach human-centered design. We teach, empathy, deep care, and a sense of connection and understanding of your user. One of the folks that we've been inspired by is a couple of our former students, Miri and Ellie, who have launched a company called The Landing. And The Landing is a really cool concept. If you want to check it out, we definitely encourage you to do so. We don't get any royalties. So, it's like,
this is not a commercial break.
It's not a commercial for The Landing, but we do love Ellie and Miri. But one of the things that we were really inspired by, we have, calls with our former students just to check in. One of the things that they do is they have a group of about 40 super users that they call their design council. And they've actually brought those users into their team's Slack. So their team, The Landing, has a team Slack, and they're constantly sharing ideas, building products, updates, et cetera. And they've got 40 customers who are involved in their team Slack, who see early iterations, who give feedback on ideas. But it's an amazing way of almost putting the customer in the way, so to speak, and putting them into an internal conversation to foster a fresh perspective, to foster unexpected connections. And they talk about how these customers will share ideas that they hadn't been thinking of, and they'll build on each other's ideas, and it creates a fundamentally different kind of collaboration. But we love this idea of finding a way to put the customer onto the team, so to speak. But
and I think that I'd say there that so many of the organizations we talk to, the leaders, that one of the pushbacks is, we just were talking to a leader at a different company a couple of days ago. They said, "Oh my God, we can't do that. The idea, like, we got to write patents, we got to list stuff." And what we've seen is that no idea survives contact with the customer intact. It doesn't happen. So that, meaning that what Miri and Ellie are doing is they're bouncing their best ideas off that customer, and they're changing so much with those interactions, and they're getting so much rich input early. And I'd say for those of you who've taken design thinking, that's the point of it, is actually showing early prototypes. And that's something to think about how to build into your own practice and your team's practice.
So we've covered 3 of these 8 levers to balance your portfolio perspectives. These three are outside the building, and we want to, there's 5 that are inside the building, so to speak, or inside the company. But what we want to just wrap this part of the talk with is say, when all else fails, leave the building. The vast majority of the time, the answers aren't in the building, and probably the answers aren't on your team. And building in this habit, there's a couple of fun blog posts here, one on Richard Feynman, who had a habit of what he called visiting other fields. But when he was at Princeton, he would go and sit with the biologists for a couple of weeks at their lunch table. And he ended up taking a few biology classes, and he ended up writing writing biology papers. And then he would go sit with the chemists, and and the point is he made a habit of provoking his thinking by seeking out other fields. And then the other post there is about Brian Grazer, who's a Hollywood producer. And he had the habit early in his career, he said every single day he had what he called a curiosity conversation, where he literally scheduled a conversation with a different person in the industry every day. And now, and by the way, now on his staff, he has a position for someone who schedules his curiosity conversations. So it's not a practice that he abandoned once he became famous. Now he's talking with, Isaac Asimov and, Neil deGrasse Tyson. And, his interests have expanded significantly since those early days. But this notion of curiosity conversations and as he says, and he's got a great book called A Curious Life, he says, I'm not looking for movie topics. I'm not looking for story topics. I'm trying to meet curious people and hear interesting things that keeps my thinking fresh and keeps me invigorated. And this reminds me of an idea that has really been powerful for me, but is what's my input quota? Am I deliberate about inputs, and am I seeking out collaborators as part of that meeting and input quota, where I'm interacting with enough people who will provoke my thinking in fresh ways that I'm likely to yield a harvest of innovative output? So those are the 3 on the outside that we want to talk about. But the reality is many of us spend most of our days inside of organizations, inside of existing teams. And so we want to talk about several levers within the organization that you can pull to help make sure that your portfolio perspectives is balanced or not imbalanced in the wrong direction. And the first one's pretty counterintuitive.
Yeah, it's this idea of cultivating weak links. So there's some research out of Princeton that you could reference as Martin Roof did some looking at entrepreneurs and their social networks and who they were tapping to have conversations with. And what's interesting was the more entropy you had, the more you had a couple random different fields. So going back to even like the Darwin example is if in your network, as you're doing your work, you maintain some connections that aren't on your routine team, aren't the people you're always talking to, aren't the people you're always executing with. Catherine, Jeremy, and myself, as we're developing programs, we routinely try to gather people from other fields. We had this neuroscientist come in and give us some thoughts, about what we were doing and how to handle perception, all this kind of got our thinking going a whole new way. And that seems intuitive. And it's something that we have found in our practice, we have to actively look at and actively question. If we're going to do this new thing, have we actually tapped our network and talked about who might have an interesting perspective? What sort of weak connection, in a way, somebody we don't usually talk to, do we want to pull into this? Michael Arena wrote a book about adaptive space. He ran HR for General Motors and now runs HR, I believe, for all of Amazon or part of Amazon. Wrote an amazing book about this and about really analyzing that in innovation. What he noticed was there was this space of sort of like these different kinds of connections that really backed up the Princeton research. In General Motors in particular, some of their new concepts came because people tapped people that were not part of the standard execution path for that product or service. They were bringing in these teams and tapping resources that were outside of that, even outside of the corporation, routinely to bring the innovation to market.
One of the favorite kind of anecdotes here is if you're familiar with Pixar, the movie studio that's made a bunch of really, they're great. Steve Jobs was CEO of Pixar for a while, and Ed Catmull in his book mentioned that Pixar makes movies. Pixar's building was Steve's movie, meaning Steve poured as much of his time and attention in the architecture of their headquarters as the company's poured into its movies. And one of the things that's really interesting about Steve's design of the building is for years, it's since changed because of, employee anger and madness. But for years, they only had one bathroom in the center of the building. And Steve's whole reason for that was he wanted people who don't see each other often to have to run into each other. And so the way he forced it was mail rooms only in one central location, conference rooms only in one central location, bathrooms in only one central location. And then people are bound to serendipitously run into each other because that's the only bathroom in the building. And then I think, that policy has been adjusted over time. But the point there is Steve Jobs really fundamentally believed in the importance of spontaneous connections and went so far as to design space to facilitate it. And it's a great question of, are we as thoughtful about weak links and maintaining weak connections, especially in this age of COVID, when so many of our meetings are only essential meetings with people that we really have to be meeting with. And so it's a great question for all of us to consider. How do we cultivate the connections and those serendipitous interactions that were a part of our physical meeting spaces? The next topic that we want to mention, the next lever, is this idea of inexperienced experience. And it's actually a principle that we leverage from another movie studio, probably the only other movie studio besides Pixar to have a string of incredible successes. Can anybody name it? It's Marvel. The Marvel Comics universe, one of the things that's unique about it is I think 15 of the 17 directors who've directed MCU movies had no previous experience with the genre. They had none whatsoever. And it's a deliberate strategy by the folks at Marvel, what they called inexperienced experience, meaning they deliberately sought out directors who had experience with opera. They would have them direct an MCU movie. With spy thrillers, they would have them direct an MCU movie. With romantic comedy, they would have them direct. And the reason for that is they wanted to have a fresh perspective on the genre. And so they selected for what they call internally inexperienced experience. And the reality is this is actually a principle that goes a lot deeper than Marvel. Marvel's incredible success is a testament to the value of that perspective. But there's another company called Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, which if you don't know it is actually 3M. But 3M has for a long time had a policy where every few years they rotate engineers. They rotate their engineering department because they know somebody who's really deep in adhesives, for example, after 4 or 5 years, they kind of plateau in terms of the number of new connections they make. So then they put them on the optics team. And all of a sudden, they bring all of this wealth of experience that they gleaned from the adhesives group into optics, and they start seeing connections that folks in optics aren't seeing. And they call it conceptual blending. But the idea is that they're forcibly rotating people in order to share experience and create this same inexperienced experience phenomenon. We don't have to belabor this, but there's a great passage about HewlettPackard doing the same thing in the early days. And they say it was like a paradise for creativity there. Because folks were rotated through responsibilities, they were selecting for inexperienced experience. And so I think the question for us and thinking about that lever is, where is someone who has valuable experience but knows nothing about your field, and what perspective might they bring to bear on the work you're doing?
So the notice novice is something that came up to us in a conversation with another Phil Peters story. Phil, you're getting a lot of airtime here. This is an introduction from Phil Peter, who is a good friend who's on the Zoom right now. He introduced us to Linda Hill. You may have read her book. I think it's terrific. We get nothing for you buying it, but it's Collective Genius, and I think it's a terrific book about leading creativity. And we had a series of conversations with her, and it was well into those that she had this octopus sitting on her desk. And she started talking about her next book, and she's looking at this octopus. And
a drawing of an octopus, not a real octopus, a drawing.
Not a stuffed octopus. And she's looking at it. Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, no octopus was killed in this story. I just watched that movie, by the way, if you want to digress for a minute. It's a great movie. My Octopus Teacher. Anyway, we get no funding, but this is like an infomercial of this. I'm the infomercial guy. Like, and one more, you'll get a copy of whatever. Anyway, we're talking to Linda. She has this stuffed octopus on her desk, and she's staring at it as she talks about this new book she's writing. And she said, yeah, I'm really struggling trying to understand this analogy that so-and-so had brought to me, and trying to understand what she meant about this octopus being related to organizations and all this stuff. And we said, well, who's the person? And she said, oh, well, I always have a really young first-time writer on as a collaborator and a co-author on any book I do. In this book, it's Emily Truelove was I think a PhD or grad student of hers, and became a co-author on the book. And she says she says a couple things. One is, if I write book after book after book, I'm in a rote process, and I sort of think of these, I do the proposal, I do the chapters, I would do that all normally. Having a novice in there, it gets kind of messy again every time. And the second thing is, she said they just provoke me to stop and think about things differently, because they're seeing things for the first time. And she says, I find it incredibly frustrating at times, to be honest, to sort of feel like I got to stop and I got to try to understand. But it drives so much more quality in my work, which I thought was really amazing from a super successful writer. The other one, if you've read about the headlines, this piece of art, the first NFT, I believe that any big auction house sold. This was sold by Christie's, a Beeple piece of art. It's an artist out of the Midwest. He sold a non-fungible token, which means you have the right to call the art yours, for $69 million. Amazing. And the story, a friend of mine is an executive at Christie's, and she told this story to Jeremy and I a while ago. And I guess maybe it had been in the press a bit, but the idea that Christie's did it came from two interns. Two interns came up and told the senior managers, hey, there's something to these NFTs. We should let us put one in an auction. Okay. And to their credit, they said, okay, we'll try it. They put the reserve price at $100. It sold for $69 million. It's like, you can't make this stuff up. It's because they were open to a perspective of novice. And these, I think it was two women. They were catalogers, and they just started there. One was literally an intern, and they've gone on to figure out more. I think they did another NFT auction last night. I didn't follow it, but there's one coming up again. But this is amazing that by listening to novices' perspective, they were able to think about, well, maybe our auctions aren't just for pieces of art that hang on a wall or sculptures that sit somewhere. Maybe they could be for something different. So a fascinating story about not only having a novice perspective, but listening to it.
The thing that's interesting, and there's a lot of good research that supports this. Our friend Bo Lotto is a neuroscientist who's written a great book called Deviate. But Bo put it to us this way. He said, pairing experts and novices is a fantastic strategy, because novices ask great questions but don't know it. Experts know great questions but can't ask them. And so if you put them together, you dramatically increase your likelihood of asking and identifying a great question. And so it's a really interesting tactic. And the thing that's amazing is, and I see some of these comments in the chat, how do you create space for a novice to actually say something that sounds silly, perhaps? There's a great example. I don't know if any of you have read Skunk Works, but Lockheed Martin's famous innovation laboratory, one of its major successes is the stealth bomber. And the stealth bomber is a radical new innovation that, changed warfare, changed the world, truly. Where it came from was a young mathematician in Ben Rich's department named Dennis Overhauser, who happened to read an obscure Russian math paper based on Maxwell's field equations, okay? Novices are looking in places that experts don't look, okay? So he reads this math paper. It's been written 10 years ago. Even Russians wrote it off and they didn't do anything with it. We find out years later from the Russian scientist who wrote the paper, he said, my own scientists didn't do anything with this stuff. But this young mathematician read this paper and came to Ben Rich and said, I think these formulas will give us the secret for the lowest radar signature possible. Do you mind if I run them and figure out what is the proper cross section for a design? It's actually a physical design. And so Ben Rich, to his credit, said, sure, do it. And he came back with the craziest looking, piece of equipment that anyone had ever seen. The interesting thing is two things. One, the stealth bomber had a radar signature 1/1000th of the next best innovation that had ever been created. And by the way, many companies were working to create low radar signature aircraft. 1/1000th. Okay, so I think from a radar judges its size the size of a eagle's eyeball. Okay, that's what a radar thinks it is. So ain't nobody picking that thing up from a distance. What's fascinating is Ben Rich tells a story that the head of aerodynamics for the Skunk Works division, you know what he said when he saw the designs being proposed by this young mathematician? Let's burn him at the stake and get back to work. Because it was so anathema to someone who's envisioned aircraft being beautiful, aerodynamic. The reality is the stealth bomber it's unstable on all three axes. Technically speaking, it shouldn't be able to fly, right? But with computers being able to stabilize, all of a sudden they were able to materialize this design. But the point is, conventional wisdom said it's a bad idea. And Ben Rich, to his credit, was willing to, they called it, actually, I forgot on the slide, the title of the internal project was what they called the hopeless diamond. That's what Lockheed Martin thought of the stealth bomber. Everyone referred to it as the hopeless diamond because it had no chance of succeeding. And yet ultimately a novice, someone with a radically fresh perspective, was able to usher in a new technology. And the point is, novices are looking in unexpected places. They're noticing unexpected things that experts tend to write off, dismiss as trivial or an outlier. And a lot of times conventional wisdom is right. So it's a challenge, but it's worthwhile to actually commission someone to be challenging conventional wisdom, because a lot of times that's where the true breakthroughs lie. The next topic is one of complementary collaborators. And we don't have to say a lot about this, but thinking about who will complement your own skill set is a critical question to ask. Great example comes from Bell Labs. This team, Walter Bratton, John Bardeen, and William Shockley invented the transistor, the solid state transistor, and enabled us to be able to have this Zoom call, for example. What's interesting is Bardeen is a theoretical physicist. He's the only physicist to win the Nobel Prize twice. And John Bardeen, he's not an experimental physicist. And so, and the story is, Bardeen would be writing up equations on the blackboard, and then Walter Bratton's experimental physicist, and he'd be at the breadboard executing the experiments. And a lot of times Bardeen would leave and say, I got to go to lunch. And Bratton would say, well, I don't know what to do until you finish the equations, or Bratton would be working on something, but he wasn't able to interpret the results till Bardeen got back. But they had this incredible back and forth between the blackboard and the breadboard, an experimental physicist with a theoretical physicist, and they could check with one another. Wow, this result is 1/1500th of what theoretically it should be. Why is that? And they would go back and forth, but they ultimately broke through in a profound way because they had a really special relationship. We were talking with our friend Claudia Kochka the other day, who is the head of innovation at Procter Gamble under A.G. Lafley's leadership. And one of the things she told us, she was responsible for all of marketing before she took over innovation. And one of the things that she told us, we were asking, what are the keys to you delivering, routinely coming up with fresh ideas? And she said one of the biggest lessons she learned is she needed her polar opposite on the team. She needed someone, and she gave us the example of, there was a person who was head of finance who told her once, Claudia, there's a limit to the number of times we can change the strategy. We can't change the strategy every day. We can't do it, And she said, good, okay, thanks. I'll get back to work, right? But again, this example of seeking out, it's so easy to dismiss someone who has a different perspective. It's so easy to write them off or to roll our eyes, rather than truly valuing and appreciating a different perspective, and being able to generate and evaluate ideas. A lot of times comes from different perspectives being mashed together with a deep sense of appreciation rather than frustration.
So the other topic is on candor. And this is something for folks that have had classes with us. I think we've done things like assessing each other's work and giving critical input. And we've talked about, and we'll talk a little bit about, that culturally what you need to make this work is you need to have a safe place where critical input is valued. If you go into the stories about Pixar, and Ed Catmull talks about these, is this ritual of dailies where folks would look at the outtakes as they're putting together the animation. Amazing stories come out about actual characters in some of these movies. I love it. Personally, I think Incredibles is the best movie ever. And some of the characters, and in Incredibles 2, I remember something about like the scene with the raccoon and sort of the baby fighting the raccoon. I'm going off on a tangent, but it's this whole thing came from somebody who wasn't the director and wasn't the storyteller saying, I think there's a chance to develop the personality of these two characters. And I had seen this differently. And it was brought up in an environment in these dailies where candor's accepted. You can speak up and have a different perspective, and we'll discuss it, evaluate it, and make some decisions as to what happens next. And Ed Catmull, his book, talks about many of the characters that have become really, really popular and people love. He can sort of draw back to these direct results of getting input from different people. The person drawing a sketch of one of these figures, or designing one of these faces, might have a very different perspective as to the personality than even the storyteller. And those things clash together in these meetings with direct and honest feedback. That's also critical. And I think that's an important thing to think about in terms of your process. Is there space for candor with your team? Is it safe for somebody to speak up with a different opinion, or even a dissenting opinion?
He said this actually, it's an area where you have to really reinforce culturally. When a new person joins, they aren't comfortable sharing unfinished work, and they aren't comfortable giving honest critique. Mm-hmm. And he said part of the ritual of the daily is actually about normalizing sharing unfinished work and being willing to speak up. And one of the hallmarks of both dailies and the Brain Trust is the owner of the work doesn't have to accept the feedback. So it's still their work. Ultimately, it's still their choice to incorporate it. But by creating a space where unfinished work is routinely shared, and dissenting opinions are routinely solicited, they find that they're able to dramatically amplify the quality of the end result by creating that space. And so there's a notion there's a notion here of psychological safety that's critically important. But what we want to do now, just in the interest of time, is we want to say, assess yourself. Mm-hmm. Actually, you can draw this on a notebook or on a piece of paper in front of you.
Or just download the deck and use it and just mark it up.
But actually draw up circles. There should be 5 there. It's very easy to recreate this wheel. Draw 5 circles, draw 4 X's through it, and give yourself a rating. Which techniques, when you think about your portfolio of perspectives, which techniques do you lean upon? And which ones have you not considered? Which ones could you maybe leverage to a greater extent? It's important to recognize that all of us have natural strengths and natural inclinations towards some things. And thinking about balance is actually really important, because a lot of times we don't know where to look. And creating the space by creating a little bit of mindfulness helps out a lot. The last thing we'll say about especially in team dynamic is that there have to be new rules of engagement for a team to work, because it's really easy when a team is tasked with creative output, every individual feels responsible. I got to be creative. And what we would say is creativity is a collective outcome many times in the context of a team. And it's counterintuitively achieved by everyone not trying to be creative, but trying to be themselves. One of our favorite collaborators at Stanford is a guy named Dan Klein, who's one of the leaders of the Stanford improvisers. And he often says, don't try to be creative, try to be obvious. And your obvious is wildly creative to the person standing next to you. And when they say something, you just say what's obvious to you. It will likely be wildly creative to them because of the radically different backgrounds. And there's so much more we can say about this topic of psychological safety. We won't say much about it now because it's another one of these topics that we could just unpack at large. But it's worth noting, am I approachable? That's a question that we would say is worth asking. Am I approachable? We know a lawyer who talked about how an entire case hinged upon a very young attorney, a novice who noticed something, entering the office of the senior partner and saying, can I close your door for a second? And the partner told us, I thought this young attorney was going to quit. It's a really hard case. We've been slogging away, but the young attorney shut the door and they said, okay, I'm either about to say the stupidest thing that any attorney's ever said, or this is the key to winning this case. And they presented they presented a stream of logic that ultimately won in the Supreme Court. But it went back to that person felt safe enough to say, I might be saying the dumbest thing an attorney's ever said. And there's a lot of richness in that question. If I don't even know where I need a novice, what can I do? I can seek to be approachable. Can someone say something incredibly dumb to me without getting their head bitten off? If so, you're probably well on your way to being a suitable environment for a novice. We have lots more of these ideas, by the way. So we want to wrap up now with 5 minutes to spare. We are writing a book called Idea Flow. We're working on it. We got a sample chapter if you want to read it. Literally, all you have to do is scan that QR code with your phone. You don't have to, by the way, there's no pressure. No one's making you. But if you want to, if you scan that, I found this very cool technology. It will literally text message me. You'll text message me right now with a pre-populated message, by the way, saying that was an amazing talk, Jeremy. You're awesome. I love you. Can I have a copy of your sample chapter? Don't delete all the complimentary text because it just makes me feel good. But I'm happy if you're curious about some more of these ideas, you can get them here.